this lady, Bette Dotson was her name, out of North Carolina. And she told me, this was back in 1986. I got my numbers reversed there. So back in 1986, she was driving her VW Beetle on the way to visit her sister in Silverstone. And she would have been 18 at that time. And she stopped at a stop sign, and her headlights, this was at nighttime, and her headlights were shining directly on a barn straight ahead. So she's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, honestly. This is small town, North Carolina. And as her headlights are shining directly on this barn, right in front of her, just across this intersection, she sees this winged human-like creature running alongside the front of this barn. She said it was about 6 or 7 feet tall, it was dark, and it had 6 articulated limbs. So it had 2 arms, 2 legs, and then 2 huge wings. And so this wasn't what most people describe, say, Mothman as looking. But this was something completely different, something completely outside of that. And so she said it looked like it was part bird and part man, and that, it was dressed, and it was wearing something sort of akin to combat boots. And, she sees this thing. She wasn't expecting to see it. And, she's terrified. And so she takes off. She peels out from this intersection. And so she takes this left turn, speeds up, and immediately, her mind is sort of racing, and she's wondering what the heck she just saw. And no sooner can she even start questioning her sighting than she hears wings flapping. And she looks into her driver's side mirror, and this thing, it's almost on top of her. It had followed her. It's giving chase. And, it's gaining ground. She didn't feel like she could go faster than probably, 45 to 50 miles per hour, because these are back roads. It's very, very curvy there. These back road 2-lane highways, and she's worried if she tries to go any faster, she's going to, end up in a ditch, and then what's going to happen to her? And so this thing's following her for miles. And
that would be
she
scary.
Said that, oh yeah, it was absolutely terrifying. And she said that the longer this thing followed her, her car engine started sputtering, and it felt like the battery was being drained, like her headlights even started dimming. And this thing overtook her car, and, it's hitting her car, like beating against her car. And she said that it was on the driver's side, sort of hitting her door, like it was trying to get in. She felt like this thing was trying to get her. And next thing she knows, she is pulling up to a road sign that read Camp Joy, which it's another little town over there. And she has no idea how she got there. She is off of her normal route, and after she checks the time, she realizes she has 4 hours of missing time.
Oh, wow.
Between when this thing overtook her, started attacking her car, the engine started sputtering and dying, all of the electrical, everything in the car, started dimming, and then next thing you know, she's just sort of, waking up driving completely off of her route to get to her sister's house. And so, she never makes it to her sister. She goes home. And so even though, she had left for her sister's around 8 p.m., it's after midnight when she gets home, and she was scared sick. But by the time she finally made it back home, she was literally in tears. And she never knew what to make of that necessarily. And that wasn't even the only incident like that in her life, and she hadn't really considered it at the time, but a few years prior, she'd had this experience where she was sitting at home in bed reading a book, and she saw this shadow cross her hallway. And she thought that was weird, and she kind of glances over, and she sees this thing peer around her doorway, and she said it had this weird grin, and it had sort of a bird face, and she sat there, frozen in fear, and she said that the thing left. Now, with that particular encounter, it's impossible to tell if that was really the end of that encounter, because we don't know if she had missing time, or if anything else happened. But considering the attack on that car, I think it's possible. I don't know if that was something, looking in on her, or if it just stopped by to scare her, or what. But
or eat her.
For what? Yeah. Well, yeah. Who knows? Or just it's just baffling what this series of encounters meant for Bet. Like what the point of those was, especially because what's interesting to me about these, is for her specifically, is that while it matches sort of the usual abduction scenario, people report stuff like this pretty similarly, consistently. Where maybe they'll be at home and they'll see, shadowy figures. Maybe they'll see like a gray or something peek around a corner, and then next thing you know, they're either being woken up at night or waking up in a weird place, or they're like Bet and they're out driving and they're accosted by some strange lights and they have missing time or something. But I'll tell you, I hadn't heard of a creature that looked like this in an abduction scenario before, and it's puzzling to me, because I'm not sure what that represents, because I think that if we consider what these things must be capable of, we really have no way of knowing what this being actually looks like. Whether or not it really was in fact sort of a winged, bird-like humanoid, or if that was just a screen memory, or if it could look like anything at once. Who knows?
Interesting. Well, maybe it came. It came back a few years later, and I don't know. It's just like, I'm going to say something too that I didn't know. If you were out and you saw a cobra and you went to kill it, and you didn't kill it, I didn't realize that cobras were really revengeful. They would, if you lived in a small village, for example, that cobra would come and look for you and to finish you off. Now, I heard this from Joe Taylor, who's the expert on this type of stuff. I never thought a snake would be smart enough. But, I could see that. If this lady had an encounter in her house a year or two or whatever it was before, and then maybe had an encounter again, for some reason it picked her for something.
It's entirely possible. And between the time that she had the brief sighting and then the attack with the missing time, she had actually had a UFO sighting in there as well. So she was home one evening, and she was awoken around 2 a.m. to this bright light flooding her room. And her first thought is, there's a mountain by her house. And so her first thought is, like, the mountain must be on fire. And so she jumps up and she looks out of her bedroom window, and she sees this cigar-shaped craft, and it is emitting these twin beams of light, and she just stands there paralyzed. She didn't really know what to do, and she was just sort of in shock. And she said afterwards, she had literally suffered from symptoms of shock and fatigue, and that her body temperature was actually much higher than normal for days afterwards. So there was a real physical effect to this, at least that time. Which, to me, these kinds of stories, these abduction scenarios, these are always some of the most terrifying for me, because if you look at not only the effect on the person experiencing it, but sort of the level of helplessness involved. I mean, there's nothing these people can do. There's nothing that could have done differently, really, that would have prevented any of this from happening to her. Like, we're talking about something that really just, it didn't give her any choice. It's not like, seeing Bigfoot or something where, maybe she could get in her car and get out of there. This isn't something that she could run from even.
No, it doesn't sound like it. And I got a funny feeling once they kind of decide whatever they want with you, it's not a one-time thing. At least from all the guests I've had on it, been abducted, the majority of them been abducted numerous times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, just, with that, I think that, it's very likely that she's been abducted multiple times. Certainly she has had multiple experiences, and I would be very surprised if there weren't more abduction events in her life. And when I talked to her, it certainly sounded like that could be true, but she didn't have the same level of recall regarding some of those. And then also, honestly, some of it too was she felt scared to talk about it. Like, she didn't want to talk about it too much, and she said that there were certain things that she absolutely would not talk about because of how scared she was. And that fear was twofold. First of all, she was afraid that talking about it might, get its attention, whatever it is. And second, she was afraid of what the phenomenon might do to her as retribution for her talking about it, because she felt like she probably wasn't supposed to talk about it. And that's pretty common too. I get that from so many witnesses, and that's almost across the board.
Oh, yes,
I've heard that similar sort of fear just of talking about it from people who have experienced hauntings, from people who are abduction experiencers, from people who have had Mothman sightings. That's surprisingly common, and it crosses these genres. So, I mean, that's just a really interesting detail to me. And so, who knows? Maybe there's some connection there. Honestly,
it sounds like it. From the sighting of the side of the car and all that stuff. I got a funny feeling. It's all tied in. It has to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's just too many similarities. I had another. Excuse me. I had another abductee that I talked to a while back. Would have been in the last year, actually. And he told me about an experience he had 10 years before that. So this would have been 2008. And this guy's name was Francis. And he said that the memories of this abduction were recovered following a concussion that he had had. He fell down some stairs. And prior to that, prior to this head injury, basically, he only had memories of seeing a strange light and then missing time. But after that, it just sort of jarred his memory, and then he could remember the entire event. So this was summer of 2008, right here in the town out of which I am based, Madison, Wisconsin. And he said, on the night of this UFO encounter, he and his lady friend were outside of her apartment. They were smoking cigarettes, and they noticed this bright light overhead. And so at first, he thought it was just the baseball lights from Warner Park. So Warner Park, for anybody not familiar with Madison, is where our semi-pro baseball team